The sea was restless that night. Black waves rolled beneath a bruised sky as the wind clawed at thousands of grey ships drifting toward an invisible shore. From the decks of destroyers, transport vessels, and landing craft came the low thrum of engines and the metallic creak of chains. A storm had passed, but the sea hadn't forgiven them. Inside one of those boats, Private Jack Collins of the 29th Infantry tried to steady his breathing. He was 21 years old, from Ohio, and he'd never been farther from home than the county fair. Now he sat shoulder to shoulder with 30 other men, every one of them soaked, shivering, and silent. The only sounds were the slap of water against steel and the soft clicking of dog tags as they trembled against chests. A lieutenant stumbled down the aisle, shouting over the engine. "Remember your training. Stay low. Move fast. Don't bunch up." No one answered. They just nodded, pretending they could hear through the roar. Collins looked down at his rifle, oiled and ready. He remembered his father's words before shipping out. "Don't be a hero, son. Just come home." Far above the waves, another world moved through the night. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes crossed the English Channel in tight formation, each one carrying paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Inside, men stood in rows, helmets bumping against the fuselage, faces painted black and green. The air reeked of sweat, fear, and engine oil. Sergeant Bill Hanley shouted over the roar of the propellers. "When that light turns green, boys, jump like the devil, S on your back." The red light glowed in the cabin. Below, flashes of anti-aircraft fire began to bloom like hellfire in the clouds. Tracer rounds streaked past the windows, orange needles tearing the night apart. Someone muttered, "Jesus Christ." Then the light turned green. The men surged forward, one after another, into the black void. Parachutes opened like white blossoms scattered across a dark sea. But the wind was vicious. Many drifted miles off target. Some crashed into flooded fields, weighted down by gear until the water swallowed them whole. Others landed in the middle of German positions, ambushed before they could even reach their rifles. The fields of Normandy became a nightmare of whispers, gunfire, and lost men trying to find each other in the dark. One paratrooper later wrote in his diary, "I could hear cows, gunfire, and men screaming, but I couldn't tell which was which." At 3:00 a.m., inside a small command room in southern England, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before his staff. The rain had nearly cancelled the invasion. Every forecast said it was suicide. But for a few short hours, the weather had eased. Eisenhower looked around the room, at Montgomery, Ramsay, Lee Mallory. He spoke quietly, but every man heard it. "Okay, let's go." Outside, soldiers already packed the docks. They loaded onto landing craft under floodlights, rifles slung, faces blank. The chaplains walked between them, handing out small Bibles, murmuring blessings no one would remember. One Marine, unable to stand the waiting, whispered, "Let's just get this over with." By dawn, the Armada was in motion. More than 5,000 ships. The largest invasion force in human history. From the cliffs of Normandy, German sentries watched the horizon fade into fog. Then they saw it. A solid line of ships, stretching farther than their eyes could see. One soldier later wrote, the sea itself had turned to steel. At 5:30 a.m., the battleships opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the world had ever heard. The sea shook. The sky flashed white, then orange, then black again. Shells the size of cars screamed overhead, slamming into the French coastline with such force that entire bunkers vanished in clouds of dust. In the landing craft behind the bombardment line, men covered their ears and prayed. The air reeked of cordite and salt. Every blast seemed to punch the breath out of their lungs. For a moment, some dared to hope the German defenses had been obliterated. Then the shelling stopped. Silence. And that silence was worse than the noise. 30 seconds, a coxswain shouted. The ramps began to lower. Spray hit their faces. Ahead, the shoreline came into view, grey sand, concrete bunkers, smoke curling like snakes from the cliffs. Machine guns waited for them. Private Collins gripped his rifle so hard, his knuckles turned white. The man next to him, Corporal James Hale, muttered, "God help us." The ramp dropped. The first man stepped forward and disappeared. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the front row. Blood splashed across helmets and rifles. Collins jumped, plunging into chest-deep water. The shock of the cold stole his breath. Around him, men thrashed, screaming, trying to swim under packs that dragged them down. A few never resurfaced. He stumbled toward the beach, tripping over a floating helmet, ducking as bullets snapped overhead. Sand exploded in his face. The world had turned to chaos, screaming thunder, salt, and death. One sergeant tried to shout orders, but his voice vanished under the gunfire. Another crawled forward with a radio that no longer worked. The air was filled with the sound of ricochets and the hiss of mortars. Everywhere, bodies. Men calling for medics who would never come. Boats exploding before they could unload. The water ran red and foamy at the tide line. From the cliffs above Omaha Beach, German gunners watched the Americans fall. Their MG-42s rattled so fast they sounded like tearing cloth. Inside the bunkers, the air was hot and choking with smoke. One German officer shouted, "Keep firing. Don't let them reach the wire." But even he could see it. They were still coming. Through the smoke and blood, small groups of Americans crawled forward. Some used the bodies of fallen comrades for cover. Engineers dragged torpedoes, long metal pipes filled with explosives, toward the obstacles. When they detonated, the earth shook again, spraying sand and steel in all directions. Small gaps appeared in the German defenses. Private Collins crawled into a crater beside a wounded medic. The man's hand was shaking as he tried to patch up another soldier. "Stay low," the medic said. "Keep your head down. They'll kill you before you stand." Collins nodded, though he barely heard him. He looked toward the cliffs, toward the flashes of machine gun fire, and wondered how anyone could survive that climb. By 8:00 a.m., Omaha was a nightmare of smoke, twisted metal, and human will. The tide carried bodies in and out, like broken promises. For 2 hours, progress was measured in inches. But the Americans refused to die quietly. Lieutenant Spaulding gathered a handful of men and shouted, "Follow me." Up the bluff. No one believed he'd make it, but he ran anyway. Collins followed. Bullets cracked around them as they crawled up the wet slope. Hands dug into mud. Boots slipped on blood and roots. Grenades burst beside them, showering dirt and screams. By the time they reached the top, only a few were left standing. They charged a bunker from behind, tossing grenades through the firing slit. The explosion blew the doors apart. Inside, 2 stunned German gunners raised their hands. The Americans didn't hesitate. The beach below was still chaos, but above it, for the first time, there was movement. Real progress. At sea, destroyers crept dangerously close to the coast. Their captains risked running aground to provide direct fire support. One sailor described it. "We could see the beach, men crawling like ants through hell." The ship's guns roared again, silencing German positions one by one. By 10 a.m., the first cracks had appeared in the German line. Engineers cleared mines, medics formed makeshift aid posts, and officers began shouting into working radios again. Word spread like wildfire. "We're breaking through." Private Collins looked around and realized something incredible. He was still alive. He pushed himself to his feet and began to run. Up the beach, a new sound joined the chaos, the deep rumble of tank engines. Amphibious Shermans, long delayed by the waves, finally rolled ashore. Their guns thundered, hammering the cliffs above. Behind them, waves of reinforcements poured in, fresh troops, ammunition, medics, and hope. The Americans were no longer dying to survive. They were starting to fight back. The smoke lifted just enough to reveal the stars and stripes fluttering above a captured bunker. A soldier pointed and shouted, "Look, we did it." But no one cheered. Not yet. Omaha still burned, and the day was far from over. The sun was rising over Normandy, but it brought no warmth. The smoke turned the sky grey and orange, casting the beaches in a ghostly light. Everywhere men lay face down, some alive, some not. Waves lapped against helmets, washing away blood only to bring more. Private Jack Collins pressed himself behind a half-buried tank trap, gasping for breath. His uniform was soaked, his rifle jammed with sand, and his hands shook so violently he could barely reload. Above him, bullets snapped past like angry hornets. He turned to the man beside him, Sergeant Hale. Hale's face was streaked with mud and blood, but his voice was steady. "We can't stay here, Jack. They'll kill us all." He pointed toward the cliffs, a jagged wall of stone and smoke. "The only way out is up." Collins stared at it in disbelief. The cliffs were nearly vertical, studded with barbed wire, mines, and machine gun nests. But he knew Hale was right. The beach was a death trap. And so, one by one, the survivors began to crawl. Up on the bluffs, German gun crews were running out of ammunition. Their commanders shouted orders drowned by explosions. Radio lines were dead, and the promised reinforcements had never arrived. Still, they fired until the barrels glowed red. To them, this was the final stand, an impossible wall against an endless sea. One young German gunner, barely 17, watched in horror as the Americans kept coming. Through his scope, he saw them crawling over the dead, dragging wounded comrades forward, refusing to stop. He whispered under his breath, "Das ist nicht möglich. It's not possible." But it was. Below, a handful of US engineers reached the base of the cliff. They unpacked their explosives, knowing they were visible targets. Private Collins and Sergeant Hale covered them as best they could, firing bursts up at the bunkers. It was useless, just noise against the thunder of machine guns, but it gave the engineers time. "Fire in the hole," someone shouted. The explosion tore through the air, blasting a hole in the barbed wire. For a moment, the beach went silent. Then Hale stood, his voice hoarse and furious. "Move! Move! Get up that hill!" And the Americans surged forward again. They climbed with their bare hands, gripping roots, rocks, and whatever they could find. Bullets zipped past, cutting through webbing and packs. One man slipped and fell. Another took his place, without hesitation. They climbed like men who had no other choice. Collins could hear his own heartbeat over the chaos. He looked up and saw Hale already halfway to the top, shouting for him to follow. Each inch was a victory. Each breath a gamble. When he finally reached the crest, his legs gave out beneath him. What he saw made his blood run cold. The top of the cliff was no safety. It was a labyrinth of trenches and concrete bunkers, still manned by desperate German defenders. Machine guns rotated toward the new arrivals, opening fire at point-blank range. The Americans returned it with everything they had. Grenades flew into bunkers, exploding in blinding flashes. The smell of cordite and burned metal filled the air. Collins crawled forward, throwing himself into a trench where Hale and two others were reloading. "Keep going," Hale yelled. "We've got to take those guns before they tear the beach apart." He pointed to a massive pillbox dominating the cliff edge, a fortress of reinforced concrete. It was the strongpoint known as WN-62, the deadliest position on Omaha Beach. It had already claimed hundreds of lives. The men moved through smoke and fire, ducking from cover to cover. A flamethrower team advanced, one man carrying the heavy fuel tank, the other the nozzle. When they reached the opening of the bunker, they unleashed a torrent of fire inside. The roar drowned everything else out. Screams followed, then silence. The machine gun stopped. For the first time that morning, the beach below grew quieter. Down on the sand, the difference was immediate. Without the main bunker firing, other German positions faltered. More Americans began to climb, rallying around the first few who had made it. Officers used signal flags and flares to mark cleared sections for incoming waves. The tide was turning, literally. As it receded, it revealed the full horror of what the first waves had endured. Twisted metal, scorched equipment, and countless fallen soldiers. A chaplain walked among them, kneeling to offer final prayers before moving on to the next. He whispered, "God, help them find peace." By midday, the Americans had clawed their way off the beach. They were exhausted, bloodied, and running low on ammunition, but alive. Collins and Hale regrouped near a hedgerow overlooking the sea. Behind them, new waves of troops were landing, bringing supplies and reinforcements. Hale lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Looks like we did it," he said, half smiling. Collins stared at the smoke rising from the coastline. "Did we?" he asked. "Feels like we just survived dying." Neither spoke for a moment. Then they heard a distant rumble, tanks. American Shermans were finally rolling inland. Their treads crushed the remains of barbed wire as they moved toward the villages beyond. But Normandy was not yet free. A few miles inland, paratroopers from the 101st were still scattered and fighting in pockets. Cut off, low on ammunition, they defended crossroads and bridges critical to the invasion. Some had held out since midnight, fending off counterattacks from German armored divisions. They didn't know that the beachheads were finally secure. They fought as if the entire invasion depended on them, because it did. Captain Richard Winters led one of those scattered groups near Sainte Marie du Mont. He'd landed miles from his target, lost most of his men, and yet by noon had captured 4 German artillery guns firing on Utah Beach. His men had turned chaos into victory, one small piece at a time. Back at Omaha, victory came slowly, painfully. The Americans had paid for every inch of ground in blood. But now, from the sea, destroyers fired their final rounds in support, and aircraft began to roar overhead. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German positions inland, clearing the way for the troops to advance. The Germans, stunned and outnumbered, began to withdraw. One officer radioed to headquarters in panic. "We are being overrun by ghosts who will not die." By afternoon, the sound of battle faded into a heavy, uneasy silence. Collins sat beside Hale in a crater, chewing a piece of hard biscuit someone had found in a ration pack. His ears still rang. Every heartbeat felt like an explosion. He looked around at the men, their faces grey with exhaustion, eyes empty. Hale glanced toward the beach, now dotted with landing craft, medics, and supply teams. "Looks like they're setting up camp," he said. Collins nodded, though he wasn't listening. His gaze lingered on the horizon, the endless sea, the same one that had delivered them to hell that morning. He whispered to himself, "We made it." But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Normandy was still a battlefield, and France was far from free. Tomorrow they'd be pushing inland, into hedgerows, villages, and ambushes waiting to happen. For now, though, they'd done the impossible. They'd stormed the most fortified coastline in the world, and lived to tell about it. As night fell, the beach was quiet again. Fires burned in the distance, casting long shadows over the water. The sea that had once been red now shimmered under moonlight. Navy ships anchored offshore sent supplies and wounded back and forth through the waves. A radio operator reported to headquarters. Omaha secured. Heavy casualties. We're holding. Eisenhower received the message hours later. He exhaled for the first time that day. Behind him, someone whispered, "God bless those boys." And on the beaches of Normandy, among the wreckage and the ghosts, a new foothold in Europe had been won. The night after D-Day was silent in a way only battlefields can be silent. The guns had stopped, but the echoes still lived in the men's heads. Smoke drifted from the cliffs, mingling with the scent of burned metal, oil, and salt. The sea rolled gently now, as if ashamed of what it had witnessed. Private Jack Collins sat beside the wreck of a half-buried landing craft, his rifle across his knees. His hands were black with grime, his uniform torn and stiff with blood. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. He didn't feel alive, only awake. Beside him, Sergeant Hale wrote in a small, blood-stained notebook. When Collins finally spoke, his voice was cracked. "Why are you writing?" Hale looked up, eyes hollow. "So I don't forget," he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, "And so someone else doesn't forget either." Far behind the beach, tanks rumbled inland under a pale moon. The roads were choked with trucks, jeeps, and wounded men being carried back toward the ships. Medics worked under flickering lanterns, moving from one stretcher to the next, whispering comfort in languages the dying no longer understood. The beach had become a machine, precise, relentless. Supply officers shouted for ammunition. Bulldozers cleared wreckage to create makeshift harbors. Priests moved among the dead, tracing crosses in the air. War has no silence, only different kinds of noise. By morning, the Americans were moving again. The beaches were secure, but Normandy itself was not. Beyond the cliffs lay a maze of bocage, narrow lanes bordered by high hedgerows, thick with trees and mud. Perfect ground for ambush. The enemy had pulled back into those green walls, waiting. Collins marched with what remained of his platoon. Every few yards they froze, rifles raised, hearts hammering at the sound of rustling leaves. Sometimes it was the wind. Sometimes it was. The first ambush came near a small farmhouse outside Colville. A burst of machine gun fire shredded the front of the column. Men dropped instantly, silent, like puppets with cut strings. The survivors dove into the ditch, returning fire blindly. Hale crawled forward, shouting over the gunfire, "Flank left." "Get around them." Collins followed, every movement through the hedgerow like crawling through knives. They found the gun, a German MG-42 hidden behind hay bales. Hale tossed a grenade through the window. The explosion flattened the roof. When it was over, the farm burned. A chicken limped across the yard, feathers black with soot. Hale sat down hard in the dirt, staring at the flames. "Doesn't even feel like winning," he said. Collins didn't answer. He just looked at the bodies, some wearing American helmets, some German, all young. 2 days later, the rain came. It fell endlessly, turning roads to rivers and fields to gravel. The wounded groaned under tarps, tanks bogged down to their turrets. Still, the men pressed on. They fought for towns whose names they couldn't pronounce: Isigny, Cayenton, St. Lo. Each one cost blood. Each one looked the same when it was over: burned, broken, and silent. At Cayenton, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne fought house to house. Collins's unit was sent to reinforce them. He found himself in a cobblestone street littered with shell casings and shattered glass. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the sweet, rotten scent of apples from a crushed market cart. A sniper's shot cracked from a church tower. The bullet took the man next to him through the neck. Collins fired back again and again until the tower collapsed in a shower of stone and dust. When the noise stopped, he realized his hands were still squeezing the trigger long after the rifle was empty. That night, they rested in the ruins of a farmhouse. Rain dripped through holes in the roof, pooling around their boots. Hale passed around a canteen of coffee, cold, bitter, perfect. "You think anyone back home'll believe what this was like?" he asked. Collins looked into the dark, listening to distant thunder. "They won't," he said. "And I hope they never have to." Back on Omaha Beach, the transformation was complete. What had been a slaughterhouse was now a city. Bulldozers carved roads through dunes, cranes unloaded crates of ammunition, and rows of tents stretched to the horizon. The dead were gathered with care, tagged, and laid side by side. A reporter from Stars and Stripes wrote, "Yesterday, this beach belonged to the enemy. Today, it belongs to history." But for the men who had lived it, history was too clean a word. They didn't see victory, they saw faces. The friend who didn't make it off the boat. The medic who stayed behind for one more wounded man. The boy from Kansas who had promised to write home. A week later, Eisenhower visited the beaches himself. He walked among the wreckage quietly, hands behind his back. When he reached the cliffs above Omaha, he paused. Below him, the tide rolled in and out like a heartbeat. An aide approached. "Sir, the men would like to know what to tell their families, what to say this means." Eisenhower stared at the horizon for a long time before answering. "Tell them it means the beginning of the end of tyranny," he said. Then, almost to himself, "and the beginning of a debt we can never repay." Further inland, the fight for Normandy raged on. The Germans counterattacked with tanks and artillery, trying to push the Allies back into the sea. But the Americans held. Every hill they took became a fortress, every field they crossed, a monument. When the clouds finally broke, Allied aircraft filled the sky, thousands of them. The sound was deafening, endless. Bombers hit rail lines, bridges, convoys. For the first time, the enemy was on the run. Collins watched them pass overhead and whispered, "That's the sound of going home." But Hale shook his head. "No," he said softly. "That's the sound of more boys heading the other way." By the end of June, the Allies had landed nearly 1 million men in France. The beaches were supply lines now, rivers of fuel, food, and steel flowing toward the front. Normandy was theirs, but the price was almost unbearable. Omaha alone had taken over 2,000 American lives in one day. The sand would never forget. Collins visited the water's edge once more before his unit moved on. He stood where he had crawled ashore weeks earlier. The tide was calm, the air clear, and in the shallows he could still see fragments of helmets, boots, and twisted metal glinting beneath the waves. He took a photograph from his pocket, the one he'd kept dry through everything, his family on their porch in Ohio. He looked at it, then at the horizon, and tucked it back into his jacket. There was nothing left to say. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the chaplain held a service on the bluff overlooking the beach. Hundreds of soldiers gathered in silence, helmets under their arms. The wind carried the sound of the waves, the smell of salt and gunpowder. When the prayer ended, no one moved for a long time. Then someone began to hum softly, "Amazing Grace." Others joined, one by one, until the melody drifted across the sea that had carried them there. It wasn't triumph. It was remembrance. In the years to come, people would speak of D-Day as a moment of glory, a day of victory and liberation. But for the men who were there, it was something else entirely. It was the longest day, the loudest silence, the line between courage and survival blurred forever. Jack Collins made it through Normandy, through France, through the war. He went home, built a quiet life, and rarely spoke about what he'd seen. When people asked, he would simply say, "I was there the day the world changed." And when he stood by the sea in later years, old now, grey and slow, he would sometimes close his eyes and hear it all again. The engines, the shouting, the thunder of shells. The sound of courage, fear, and fate colliding on a single stretch of sand. The sound of men climbing out of hell. Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, Sod. 5 names carved into history, beaches where boys became soldiers and soldiers became brothers. They didn't fight for glory. They fought so others would never have to see what they saw, never have to wade through that red surf again. And as the tide still rises and falls over Normandy, the sea carries their memory. The echo of footsteps, the whisper of waves, and the eternal promise that their sacrifice was not in vain.